So, here's something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. Somewhere in the last day or two, without noticing, you almost certainly said something that came straight off the deck of a wooden ship. If you ever felt taken aback, that is a sail pressed flat against its own mast by a sudden shift of wind. If you gave someone a wide berth, or a little leeway, or waited for the bitter end, you were speaking the language of men who worked rope and canvas 300 years ago. By and large, high and dry, 3 sheets to the wind. The words drifted up off the water and into your mouth, and they never left. They are with you right now, in the dark, whether or not you have ever set foot on a boat. So tonight we are going to spend a couple of hours with the ships those words came from. All of them. Not one famous vessel, but the whole crowded harbor of the golden age of sail, taken slowly, one kind of ship at a time. The little sloop that a pirate could hide in a shallow cove, the towering treasure galleon, the great ship of the line with 100 guns, the Chinese junk with sails like a folding fan. We are going to walk down the waterfront and look at each of them in turn and understand what made each one what it was. If you drift off somewhere along the way, that is completely fine. That is honestly the whole idea. You do not need to remember which ship had how many masts. You do not need to hold on to a single name. The ships will still be here in the morning, riding quietly at anchor, and so will you. Neither one is in any hurry. So let's start where any sailor would start. Not with a battle, and not with buried treasure, but with something simpler. With how you actually read a ship when you see one on the water. Because to a landsman, one old sailing ship looks much like another. Tall masts, white sails, a wooden hull. But to anyone who worked the sea, a ship announced itself long before you could see a single face on deck. You could tell what she was for, and often where she came from, just from her shape against the sky. And there were really only 3 things you had to look at. The first was the hull, the body of the ship, not just how long it was, but how big. And ships were not measured the way you might expect. They were not weighed. They were measured by how much they could carry in a unit called the ton, or the ton, which began as the space taken up by a large barrel of wine. So when an old record says a ship was 200 tons, it is not telling you what she weighed. It is telling you roughly how much cargo she could swallow. A little coastal trader might be 50 tons. A treasure galleon might be 1,000. The number is a rough thing, measured different ways in different countries, so you should hold all of these figures loosely. They are a sense of size, not a precise weight on a scale. The second thing was the masts. How many tall poles stood up out of the deck? 1, 2, 3, sometimes 4. That alone told you a great deal. A single mast meant a small, handy boat. 3 masts meant something built to cross an ocean. And the third thing, the one that really mattered, was the rig, the way the sails were arranged on those masts. This is the part worth slowing down for, because almost everything else follows from it. There were, broadly, 2 ways to hang a sail. The first is called square rig. The sails hang from long horizontal beams, called yards, set across the ship, so the canvas stretches from side to side. Picture the classic tall ship of a painting, with its great stacked squares of white. That is square rig. It is wonderful for one particular thing. When the wind is behind you or over your shoulder, those big square sails catch an enormous amount of it and push you along, hour after hour, across open ocean. Square rig is what carried ships across the Atlantic and around the world. But it has a weakness. It cannot sail well toward the wind, turn a square-rigged ship to point up into the breeze, and the sails lose their power and flap. And square rig needs men, a lot of them. Someone has to climb aloft, out along those yards, to set and take in every sail by hand. The other way is called fore-and-aft rig. Here the sails run the long way, along the length of the ship, from front to back, usually hung from a slanting spar or a boom that swings across the deck. This kind of sail is not as good at running straight downwind, but it can do the thing square rig cannot. It can sail close to the wind, cutting up toward it at an angle, working its way upwind in a way a square-rigged ship simply cannot match, and it needs far fewer hands to work it. One small crew can manage a fore-and-aft rig that would have taken a crowd to handle if it were square. So already you can feel the shape of a choice. Square rig for the long ocean haul with a big crew. Fore-and-aft for handiness and for clawing upwind with a few men. And most of the cleverest ships, as you will see, mix the two, putting square sails on one mast and fore-and-aft on another, trying to get a little of both. There is one more thing to notice before we start walking the waterfront, and it is a quiet one: how deep the ship sits in the water. This is called the draft. A ship with a deep draft, a deep keel reaching down, is steady and strong in a big ocean swell, but it needs deep water under it. It cannot come close inshore without running aground. A ship with a shallow draft sits lightly on the surface. It can slip into shoals and river mouths and hidden coves where a bigger ship would tear her bottom out. Hold on to that idea of draft. It is going to matter enormously when we get to the pirates, because a shallow draft was, more than guns, more than speed, one of the great secrets of staying free. So that is how you read a ship: the hull and how much it carries, the masts and how many, the rig and which way it likes the wind, and how deep it sits. 4 simple things. Everything else is detail. Now let's go down to the water and start with the smallest ship that really mattered, the one a pirate would have chosen first. If you had asked almost any pirate of the great years, the years around 1716 and 1720, what ship he would choose if he could have any, a surprising number would not have pointed at the biggest thing in the harbor. They would have pointed at something small, a sloop. The sloop is the little one. In its purest form, it has a single mast, set fairly far forward, carrying a fore-and-aft mainsail behind it, and a triangle or two of headsail out front, on a long spar called the bowsprit that reaches ahead of the bow. That is the whole ship. One mast, a big mainsail, a jib or two, and a low, clean hull sitting lightly on the water. There is nothing grand about it, and that was exactly the point, because a sloop was fast. With that fore-and-aft rig, she could sail close to the wind, working her way upwind in a way that left square-rigged ships wallowing behind her. She was handy, meaning she turned quickly and answered her helm, so a small crew could throw her around almost like a large dinghy, and she drew very little water. Her shallow hull could slip into a bay, or a river mouth, or a maze of shoals and sandbars where anything larger would run hard aground. She could go where the Navy could not follow. Think about what that meant for a man living outside the law. You are being hunted by warships far bigger than you. So what do you actually need? You do not need to win a battle against them. You need to never have to fight one. You need to see them first, and then be gone, upwind, into shallow water, before they can close the distance. A sloop did all of that. She was cheap to buy or to steal, cheap to keep, and light enough to be hauled over onto her side on a quiet beach so the crew could scrape the weed and worm off her bottom and keep her fast. That last chore, called careening, mattered more than you might think. A foul, weed-choked hull slows a ship badly, and a slow pirate is a caught pirate. So the sloop gave a pirate the three things he wanted most: speed to run, shallow draft to hide, and a small enough crew that the shares of plunder did not have to be split 100 ways. Two kinds of sloop earned a particular name for themselves, and both came out of the Caribbean world. The first was the Jamaica sloop, built around that island and through the West Indies, often from local cedar, with a gaff rig and a narrow, quick hull. She was known for her turn of speed, able to reach something like 12 knots in the right wind, which was genuinely fast for the day. The second, and the more famous, was the Bermuda sloop. The Bermuda sloop was a small marvel, and the secret was partly in the wood. Bermuda had stands of a local cedar that resisted rot in a way ordinary oak did not. An oak hull might last 10 years before the sea ate into it. A Bermuda cedar hull could last 3 times that. So the islanders built light, strong, long-lived hulls, and on top of them, they set tall, steeply raked masts and very long bowsprits, carrying a great spread of fore and aft canvas for the size of the boat. The result was a vessel that could genuinely outrun almost anything afloat, and could do the one thing that mattered most in an escape. She could turn and run upwind. A heavier, square-rigged pursuer, trying to follow her up into the breeze, would simply be left behind, sails flogging, watching her shrink toward the horizon. So which pirates actually sailed sloops? Most of them, at one time or another. Sam Bellamy, the one they called Black Sam, made his early captures in sloops before he ever took the bigger ship that made him famous. Stede Bonnet, the gentleman planter who threw away a comfortable life to go on the account, went to sea in a sloop he had actually paid for, which almost no pirate ever did, and named her the Revenge. And even Blackbeard, whose flagship was a large and frightening vessel, kept smaller sloops around him as tenders and consorts, quick little ships to scout ahead, to chase down prizes, and to slip into shallow water. One of them he called the Adventure. When a pirate captain had a squadron, the flagship was the fist, but the sloops were the fingers. They did the reaching and the grabbing. There was, of course, a limit to what a sloop could do. She was small. She could not carry many guns, perhaps a handful of light cannon and some swivel guns mounted on the rail, enough to frighten a merchantman into surrender, but not nearly enough to trade broadsides with a real warship. She could not hold a great deal of plunder, and she could not keep the sea for months at a time the way a bigger ship could. So a sloop was not the ship you wanted for a war. She was the ship you wanted for a life. Quick, quiet, and always ready to disappear. And when a pirate wanted just a little more of everything, a little more sail, a little more crew, a little more reach, without giving up that precious handiness, he had somewhere to go. He added a second mast. Which brings us to the schooner. The schooner takes the idea of the sloop and stretches it. Instead of one mast, she has 2, and in the classic form, both of them carry fore and aft sails, with the aftermast, the mainmast, usually as tall as or taller than the one in front. Often, in the earlier ships, the foremast would also carry a square topsail or 2 up high to help her run before the wind. But her heart was that long, low, fore and aft rig, and it gave her the same gift the sloop had, only more of it. She could sail beautifully to windward. She was fast, and she could still be worked by a fairly small crew for her size. Where did she come from? The schooner is, above all, a North American ship, the tradition, and it is worth telling as a tradition, rather than as a proven fact, is that the first true schooner slid down the ways at Gloucester, in Massachusetts, in the year 1713, built by a man named Andrew Robinson. The old story even claims a bystander cried out something like, "Oh, how she scoons," using an old word for skimming lightly over the water, and that the name stuck. Historians are fairly sure that charming little tale is folklore, and that the word and the rig both existed in some form earlier. But the deeper truth in it is real enough. The schooner grew up in the colonies of North America, along that long coast of bays and inlets and fishing grounds, and it fit those waters like a hand fits a glove. By the end of the 1700s, the schooner had become the great workhorse of the American coast. She carried fish and lumber and cargo up and down the seaboard, in and out of shallow harbors, handled by a few men. And later, in the decades after our story, her lines were drawn out sharper and finer into the famous Baltimore clippers, some of the fastest sailing vessels ever built, used by privateers, and less proudly, by slavers, precisely because so little could catch them. For a sea raider, the appeal was obvious. A schooner had the speed and the windward reach of a sloop, but with 2 masts, she could carry more sail, more men, and more guns, and she could keep the sea a little longer. In the peak years of the great pirates, the type was still young, and the single-masted sloop was more common in their hands. But everything that made a sloop precious to a hunted man, the schooner had too, with a little more room to grow into. She was, you might say, the sloop that decided to stay out a while longer. So, those are the small, quick ships, the ones built around speed and shallow water, and a light touch on the helm. Now, let's go a step larger, to the 2-masted ships that did the ordinary heavy work of the sea. The ones that were not glamorous, and that a pirate was more likely to actually own. Between the little single-masted sloop and the great ocean-crossing ships sat a whole family of 2-masted vessels, and they were the ordinary heavy horses of the age. Not glamorous, not fast the way a Bermuda sloop was fast, but strong, roomy enough, cheap enough, and everywhere. If you had stood on any busy quay in the early 1700s and simply counted, a great many of the hulls you saw would have been one of these 3. The brigantine, the brig, and the snow. They look alike to a modern eye. The difference between them is all in how the sails are hung, and it is worth taking slowly, because it tells you what each one was for. Start with the brigantine. She has 2 masts. The one in front, the foremast, is square-rigged, carrying those stacked horizontal sails for driving along with the wind behind. The one behind, the mainmast, is fore-and-aft rigged, carrying a big slanting gaff sail that runs the length of the ship. So the brigantine is a hybrid, and a clever one. The square foremast gives her power downwind. The fore-and-aft mainmast lets her point up toward the wind and stay handy. She gets a little of both worlds. She was quick, she turned well, and she could carry a fair number of men and a fair number of guns for her size, which was usually somewhere between 30 and 150 tons. And here is a small thing that tells you a lot. The word brigantine comes from the Mediterranean, from the Italian brigantino, which is tied to the word brigand, a raider, a robber. The ship was named, in its very roots, for the kind of men who used it. So it should be no surprise at all that pirates and privateers loved the brigantine. It was faster and more nimble than the bigger ships, stronger and better armed than the little ones, and it could keep the sea for a proper cruise. For a raider who wanted more reach and more teeth than a sloop could give, without climbing all the way up to a great ship he could barely crew, the brigantine sat right in the sweet spot. Now change one thing. Take that fore-and-aft mainsail off the back mast and make the mainmast square-rigged too, so that both masts carry the stacked square sails. Now you have a brig. A brig is, in effect, a small square-rigged ship with 2 masts instead of 3. She gives up some of the brigantine's easy handiness upwind, and she asks for more hands to work all that square canvas. But in return, she is a steady, strong, ocean-going little vessel, and she can carry a real broadside of guns along her sides. Navies used brigs by the dozen for patrol and escort and carrying messages, and merchants used them for everything. If the brigantine was the raider, the brig was the reliable soldier and the reliable carter, doing the plain work of the sea without complaint. And then there is the snow, which is the strangest and, in a quiet way, the cleverest of the 3. A snow looks almost exactly like a brig, 2 masts, both square-rigged. But if you look closely at the mainmast, you will see a second, very thin pole standing just behind it, running up alongside. That little extra spar is called the trysail mast, or the snow mast. Its whole job is to carry the fore-and-aft gaff sail so that the sail can be set and handled without fouling the big square mainsail on the main mast itself. It is a small refinement, but it let the snow fly a full square mainsail and a handy fore-and-aft sail at the same time, cleanly. And it made her one of the most capable 2-masted rigs ever devised. The Snow was typically the largest of the 2-masted vessels, and she was a favorite for both trade and war, with the naval versions carrying somewhere in the range of 5 to 16 guns. So picture the 3 of them side by side at the dock. The brigantine, square in front and fore and aft behind, quick and raffish. The raider. The brig, square on both masts, solid and plain, the workhorse. And the Snow, almost a brig but with that whisper of an extra mast, the most refined of the 3. To the men who sailed them, telling them apart was as natural as you telling a car from a van. To us, it is a small puzzle of rope and canvas. But once you can see it, you can never quite unsee it, and every old painting of a harbor becomes a little more legible. None of these 3 was the thing a pirate captain dreamed about on a long night watch, though. When he let himself imagine the perfect ship, the one that would make every merchant strike his colors at the sight of her and never dare to fight, he was usually imagining something bigger. He was imagining a ship, a full-rigged ship. So let's go and look at her. When people in the age of sail said the word ship and really meant it as a specific type rather than just any boat, they meant one particular thing. 3 masts, and every one of them square-rigged, with the addition of a fore and aft sail on the aftermost mast, the mizzen, for steering and balance. That was the full-rigged ship, and it was the standard great vessel of the deep ocean. Every serious warship and every serious ocean trader was built on this plan. It is the shape you see in your mind when you close your eyes and picture a tall ship. 3 towers of stacked white canvas, a long, deep hull, a crowd of rope, and a crew of dozens or hundreds swarming over all of it. A full-rigged ship could carry an enormous spread of sail, which meant she could carry a heavy load a long way at a steady pace. And because she was big and strongly built, she could carry a serious number of guns along her sides, on one deck or 2. That combination, deep hull, big crew, many guns, is exactly what a pirate wanted for a flagship. Not to hide. A ship this size could not hide, but to overwhelm. A merchant captain who sighted a well-handled, full-rigged ship bristling with cannon and packed with armed men usually made the only sensible choice. He surrendered without a shot. The whole art of the great pirate captains was to make fighting look pointless, and a big ship did that better than anything. The clearest example is a ship you may have heard of without knowing what she was. The Whydah. She belonged, at the end, to Black Sam Bellamy. and her story holds almost the whole lesson of this kind of ship, the good and the bad of it, in one hull. The Whydah galley was built in London in the year 1715, and she was built for the slave trade, financed by a wealthy London merchant named Humphrey Maurice. She was a full-rigged ship of around 300 tons, something like 110 feet long, and she was also a galley, which here means she had oar ports low in the hull, so she could be rowed in a flat calm. She was fast, said to make as much as 13 knots. She carried around 18 guns, with room for more. She had already done the thing she was built for, carrying hundreds of enslaved people across the ocean, when Sam Bellamy caught her in the Caribbean early in 1717, near the end of her voyage, when her holds were full of the payment for that human cargo, in gold and silver and ivory. Bellamy took her for his own, added more guns until she carried perhaps 28, and made her his flagship. And then the sea did what the Navy never managed. In April of 1717, sailing north along the coast of what is now Massachusetts, the Whydah was caught in a savage nor'easter off Cape Cod, near the town of Wellfleet, at night, in a storm so fierce that all that sail and all that strength counted for nothing. She was driven onto the shoals and torn apart. More than 140 men went down with her. Only 2 survived. Sam Bellamy, who was perhaps 28 years old, was not one of them. The great ship that had made him, the deep hull and the tall masts and the heavy guns, could outmatch any merchantman afloat, and could do absolutely nothing against a wall of North Atlantic surf in the dark. The Whydah lay under the sand off that beach for more than 250 years. Then, in the 1980s, an explorer named Barry Clifford found her, with the ship's bell eventually raised bearing her name and her date, which made her the one thing no other pirate ship has ever quite been. A wreck proven, beyond argument, to be exactly what the legend said, the only fully authenticated pirate ship of the Golden Age ever found. A full-rigged ship, built for one cruelty, captured for another, and finally kept by the sea. So the great ship gave a pirate power and presence, and asked for a large crew and deep water in return, and offered no shelter at all from the weather, that in the end killed more sailors than any cannon. Now let's leave the pirates for a while, and go and look at the richest, proudest, slowest target any of them ever dreamed of taking: the Spanish galleon. The galleon is the ship at the center of every pirate daydream and almost every pirate story. And it is worth understanding what she actually was, because the daydream and the reality pull in different directions. She was, above all, a treasure carrier, a great floating strongbox built by Spain and Portugal to move the wealth of half the world across the oceans, and built to be very hard to take. The galleon came together in the middle 1500s, an improvement on the older, rounder, top-heavy carrack. The shipwrights did 2 main things. They stretched the hull out longer and lower and narrower, which made her sail better and more steadily. And they cut down the great clumsy tower that older ships carried at the bow, the forecastle, so she would not catch so much wind at the front and fight her own helm. What they kept, and what gives the galleon her unmistakable shape, was the tall structure at the stern, the aftercastle, rising up over the rudder like the back of a wooden fortress, carved and sometimes gilded, where the officers lived and from which the ship was commanded. A high forecastle, lowered but still there, and that towering aftercastle. 2 wooden castles, fore and aft, with the working deck slung low between them. She carried 3 masts, sometimes 4. The forward masts were square-rigged for driving across the ocean, and the aftermost mast, the mizzen, carried a slanting lateen sail, a triangle, for balance and steering. She was big, An ordinary galleon might run several hundred tons, and the specialized treasure ships ran much larger, with the greatest of the Manila galleons reaching well over 1,000 tons, some said as much as 2,000. And she was armed, with rows of guns along her sides, because she was expected to have to defend herself. She was a cargo ship and a warship folded into one hull, and she was strong. What did she carry? Everything worth carrying. From the mines of the Americas came silver, mountains of it, dug and refined at a terrible human cost, along with gold and emeralds and pearls. And on the far side of the world, the Manila galleons ran a route all their own, straight across the Pacific between Manila in the Philippines and Acapulco in Mexico, 1 or 2 great ships a year, trading American silver for the silk and porcelain and spices of Asia. It was one of the longest and richest trade routes the world had ever seen, and a single one of those ships, safely home, could be worth a fortune almost beyond counting. So why, if the galleon was such a prize, are the stories of pirates capturing them so few and so faint? Here is the answer, and it is not romantic. Because Spain was not foolish. The treasure galleons did not sail alone. They sailed together in great convoys called the flota, the fleet, escorted by purpose-built warships whose only job was to protect them. A lone pirate in a sloop or even a full-rigged ship coming upon that was not looking at a prize. He was looking at his own death. A single galleon carried a large crew and a heavy battery of guns and stood high out of the water, hard to board, easy to defend. To take one, you did not need daring. You needed a fleet of your own, which is why the rare times a treasure fleet was actually taken, it was taken not by outlaws, but by a nation at war. The most famous example belongs to a Dutch admiral named Piet Hein, who in the year 1628 cornered a Spanish treasure fleet in a bay off the coast of Cuba at a place called Matanzas, and captured almost the whole of it, silver and all, with barely a fight. It made him a national hero, and it nearly broke the Spanish crown's finances for a season. But notice what it took: a war, a squadron, an admiral, and a whole navy behind him. Not one bold captain, and a fast little ship. The galleon was the dream. She was almost never the reality, and there was a price for all that strength. The galleon was slow, and with that high after castle catching the wind, she was clumsy, especially when she tried to sail toward the breeze. She was a fortress, and fortresses do not run. So she survived by never being alone, by being too strong to attack and too well guarded to catch by surprise. The very thing that made her a floating treasury, her size and her castles and her guns, made her a poor runner and a heavy sailor. She was built not to escape trouble, but to be trouble no one wanted to start. Now, the escorts that guarded her and the great fighting ships of every navy in Europe were something else again. They were not built to carry anything but war. So let's go and stand under the tallest, heaviest, most crowded wooden walls that ever went to sea. The man of war and the strange, precise system that ranked them. A man of war was a ship built for one purpose only, to fight other ships. She carried no cargo worth the name. Every foot of her was given over to guns and powder and the hundreds of men needed to serve them. And by the 1700s, the navies of Europe, above all the Royal Navy of Britain, had worked out a whole way of ordering these ships, from the greatest down to the smallest, so precisely that you can still use it today to know almost exactly what you are looking at. It was called the rating system, and it ranked a warship by one simple thing: the number of guns she carried. At the top stood the first rate, 100 guns or more, arranged along 3 full decks running the length of the ship, one above another, so that a single broadside from one side of her was a rolling wall of iron. A first-rate carried a crew of around 850 men. She was, in every real sense, a floating town, with its own carpenters and cooks and surgeons and gunners, its own hierarchy and its own laws, kept afloat and fed and disciplined for months at a time. Below her came the second rate, of about 90 guns, also on 3 decks. Then the third rate, with something like 64 to 80 guns on 2 decks. And this was the true backbone of every fleet, the most numerous of the big ships, strong enough for the hardest fighting and cheaper to build and man than the giants above her. Then the fourth rate, of around 50 to 60 guns, which sat on the fading edge of the great ships. These, the first rates down through the third, and for a while the fourth, were the ships of the line. The name comes from how they fought. In a great sea battle, the fleets did not swirl about at random. They formed a long line, one ship behind another, so that every ship could fire its broadside outward at the enemy line, without hitting its own friends ahead and behind. It was slow, deliberate, thunderous work, and only the strongest ships, the ones that could stand in that line and take a pounding and give it back, were allowed a place there. That is what a ship of the line was, a ship strong enough to stand in the line of battle. Anything weaker was sent to do other work. If you want to put a face to all of this, there is one ship you can still go and stand aboard, because she has been kept in a dry dock in Portsmouth in England for a very long time. Her name is Victory. She was launched in the year 1765, a first rate carrying about 104 guns. It took something like 6,000 trees, most of them oak, to build her. She displaced around 3,500 tons, and 40 years after her launch, she became the flagship of Admiral Horatio Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar in the year 1805, the battle where the combined fleets of France and Spain were broken and where Nelson himself was killed by a musket ball on her deck. She is still there, the oldest naval ship in the world still officially in commission, held together by endless careful repair, a whole world of the age of sail preserved in oak and rope and iron, quiet now in her dock while people walk her decks and try to imagine the noise. And here is the thing to hold on to about all these great ships. No pirate ever wanted one, not really. Could you plunder with a first rate? You could not even sail one. She needed 600 or 700 men just to fight her guns, and no pirate band was ever that large or that disciplined. She drew deep water and could go nowhere shallow. She cost a kingdom to keep. She was slow to a small, quick ship and impossible to hide. The ship of the line was not the pirate's prize and not the pirate's dream. She was the pirate's nightmare. She was the thing on the horizon that meant it was time to run for the shoals and prey. The great warship was built to end exactly the kind of life we have been describing, and in the end, it usually did. But the Navy did not only hunt with giants, it hunted with something faster, leaner, and far more dangerous to a pirate in practice: the frigate. And the frigate deserves a stop of its own. The frigate was the Navy's fast ship. She sat down at the lower end of the rating system, as a fifth rate or a sixth rate, carrying somewhere between about 20 and 44 guns, and she was built on a simple idea. Take most of the guns off the lower deck, so the ship can be lighter and finer and quicker, and put your main battery up on a single covered gun deck instead. You give up the crushing weight of a ship of the line. In return, you get speed and reach, and the ability to sail well in weather that would trouble a heavier ship. A frigate could not stand in the line of battle. She was not meant to. Her work was everything else. Scouting ahead of the fleet, so admirals called frigates the eyes of the fleet, carrying urgent messages, escorting convoys of merchantmen, patrolling trade routes, chasing down anything smaller than herself, and, more than any other ship in the Navy, hunting pirates. A frigate was fast enough to catch a raider, and strong enough to destroy him when she did. If a ship of the line was the nightmare on the horizon, the frigate was the one that actually did the catching. And here is the quiet irony at the heart of the whole story. The frigate, or something very like her, was also the biggest ship a pirate could realistically hope to own. Not a ship of the line, which needed hundreds of trained men and a nation's treasury behind it, but a fast, frigate-sized, heavily armed ship, crewed by a large and determined band. That was the ceiling of pirate ambition, and the two most feared pirates of the age both reached it. Think about Blackbeard. His famous flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, did not begin life as a pirate ship at all. She was built, most likely around the year 1710, as a French vessel, and she spent her early years as a slave ship, run at one point by a slave trader out of the French port of Nantes. She was a full-rigged ship of frigate type, of perhaps 200 tons. Blackbeard captured her in the Caribbean, near the island of St. Vincent, late in the year 1717. And he did to her exactly what a pirate did when fortune handed him a real ship. He loaded her with guns. By the accounts that come down to us, she ended up carrying as many as 40, though the wreck that is believed to be her has yielded a somewhat smaller number actually found, which is a good reminder to hold these figures gently. Either way, 40 guns, or 30, in the hands of a pirate was an astonishing thing. An ordinary merchantman carried a mere handful. Blackbeard, with a private frigate, could outgun almost anything he was likely to meet that was not a proper warship. That is where the terror came from. Not from the beard and the smoking slow match woven into it, though that helped. From the guns. Her end came in June of the year 1718, when Blackbeard ran the Queen Anne's Revenge hard aground while entering an inlet on the coast of North Carolina, at a place called Beaufort. Some believe it was an accident. Some believe he did it on purpose to break up his large and unwieldy company and keep the best of the plunder for a smaller, more loyal few. We cannot be sure. What we know is that she was lost there, and that a wreck found on that spot in the 1990s is believed, on good evidence, to be her, though the certainty is not quite the flat certainty of the Whydah. Now think about Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful of them all, the Welshman who took, by some counts, over 400 ships in a career of only a few years. He gave nearly all his flagships the same name, the Royal Fortune. There was more than one of them, because a pirate used up ships and traded up whenever a better one crossed his path. The last and greatest Royal Fortune had been a frigate carrying soldiers called the Onslow, which Roberts captured off the coast of West Africa and made over into a raider of around 40 guns. With her, and with the ships that sailed in company with her, he was for a while the terror of an entire ocean. And it was off that same African coast, at a place called Cape Lopez, in February of the year 1722, that his luck finally ran out. A real warship of the Royal Navy, the Swallow, found him, disguised her approach, and closed the distance. In the fight that followed, Roberts was killed almost at once, struck in the throat by grape shot as he stood on his own deck. His crew, honoring a wish he had often spoken, wrapped his body in a sail, weighted it, and gave it to the sea before the Navy could take it. It was never found, and with him died, more or less, the great age of piracy itself. So the frigate, and the private frigate a pirate could build from a captured slave ship, sits right at the meeting point of the whole story. Fast enough to matter, strong enough to frighten, small enough to crew. It was the pirate's highest reach and, in the Navy's hands, the pirate's most likely undoing. the same kind of ship, on both sides of the chase. Now let's turn from the fighting ships to the ones that carried the wealth, and to the strangest of them all, because it was a merchant ship dressed as a warship. The East Indiaman. An East Indiaman was a merchant ship, but calling her merely that undersells her badly. She was among the largest merchant vessels regularly built in the whole age of sail, and she was built by the great trading companies, above all the Dutch East India Company, known by its initials as the VOC, and the British East India Company. These were not really companies as you think of companies now. They were something closer to private empires, with their own soldiers, their own forts, their own fleets, their own power to make war and sign treaties on the far side of the world. And the East Indiaman was the ship that carried it all home. She was big. A typical East Indiaman ran somewhere between 1,100 and 1,400 tons, with some of the largest reaching well over that, on a hull perhaps 170 feet long, with a broad 40-foot beam and 2 full decks, and a raised poop at the stern. She was full-rigged, 3 tall masts of square sail, built strong for a voyage that might last most of 2 years, out around the Cape of Good Hope to India, or on to China, and slowly home again. And her hull had a particular shape, called tumble-home, where the sides curved inward as they rose, so that the ship was widest down at the waterline and narrower up at the deck. It made her steadier under a heavy load and a heavy gun, because she was armed. That is the strange and clever thing about her. An East Indiaman carried real guns, 30 or 40 of them or more, and she was often painted to look like something even more dangerous than she was. In later years, the companies would paint their Indiamen in the black and buff stripes of a naval ship of the line, with rows of gun ports along the side, some real and some merely painted on. A raider coming close could not easily tell the difference. Was that a fat merchantman with a few guns, or a warship that would tear him apart? Could you be sure? Would you bet your ship and your life on the guess? Most would not. And that was exactly the point. The disguise did the work the guns might otherwise have had to do. Once, off the coast of Asia, a whole fleet of these Indiamen, facing a real French naval squadron, simply behaved like warships, formed a line as if spoiling for a fight, and bluffed the French commander into turning away rather than risk it. Not a broadside was needed. The costume was enough. What did all this protect? Cargo of extraordinary value. Pepper and other spices in the early years. Then tea, oceans of it, and silk, and fine cotton and printed textiles, and porcelain, and saltpeter for gunpowder, and indigo, the wealth of Asia flowing west in the holds of these great striped ships. It was cargo worth killing for, and worth dying for, and the companies knew it, which is why the Indiaman was built to look and fight like something she was not. Would a pirate have wanted her? He would have dreamed of her cargo, certainly. But an East Indiaman was a hard, dangerous target, big and well-armed and full of men who knew how to fight, and often traveling in company. Taking one was the sort of thing that made a pirate a legend, precisely because it so rarely happened. The one time it truly did, when an English pirate named Henry Every took an enormous armed treasure ship of the Grand Mughal of India, called the Zheng Yi Sao, in the year 1695. It made him the richest pirate alive and set off a manhunt that reached around the world. That capture is remembered exactly because it stood almost alone. The armed merchant giant was, for most pirates, a prize to be dreamed of from a safe distance, and then let pass. Now, let's go to the opposite end of the merchant world, away from the giant striped Indiaman to a plain, cheap, unglamorous little cargo ship that almost no one has heard of, and that quietly did more to build an empire than any galleon ever did. The Dutch fluyt. If the galleon is the ship everyone remembers, the fluyt is the ship almost no one does, and that is a small injustice, because the plain little fluyt probably shaped the modern world more than the galleon ever did. It just did it quietly, by carrying ordinary things very cheaply, year after year, until an entire small nation grew rich on the difference. The fluyt was born in the Dutch Republic, in the shipyards around the town of Hoorn in the 1590s, and it was born from a single, unglamorous question. Not how do we build a stronger ship, or a faster ship, or a ship that can fight, but how do we build a ship that can move cargo across the sea for the least possible money? Everything about the fluyt is an answer to that question. She had a strange shape. Seen from the front or the back, she looked pear-shaped, bulging out wide at the waterline, and then curving sharply inward so that her deck up top was surprisingly narrow. Part of that was to carry the most cargo down in the belly of the hull where it mattered, and part of it, so the story goes, was about tolls. In the narrow waters of the north, a ship passing through could be charged a fee reckoned partly by the width of her deck, and a fluyt with a pinched, narrow deck paid less to pass. Whether or not that was ever the main reason, the shape stuck, and it worked. But the real genius was in how cheaply she was made, and how few men she needed. The Dutch built fluyts almost the way a factory would, in specialized yards, using wind-powered sawmills and standardized parts, turning them out faster, and for something like half the cost of the ships other nations built. And because she was never meant to be turned into a warship in time of trouble, she did not have to be built heavy and strong for guns she would never carry. She carried few guns, or none. That freed up space for cargo, and it freed up men, because guns need men to work them. A fluyt could cross the sea with a small crew, a fraction of what a fighting ship of the same size would need, fewer wages, fewer mouths, more room for cargo. Every choice pointed the same way. Cheaper. And what did she carry? Not treasure. Timber from the Baltic, grain, salt, herring, wine, cloth, the plain, heavy, everyday goods of European trade, the things everyone needed and no one sang songs about. The fluyt hauled them in enormous quantity, at a cost so low that Dutch merchants could undercut nearly everyone, and so the carrying trade of Europe drifted more and more into Dutch hands. People began to call the Dutch the wagoners of the sea, the carters who would haul anyone's goods anywhere for a fair price. By the later 1600s, the Dutch merchant fleet had swollen to something like half of all the shipping in Europe, and much of that was fluyts. A small country at the edge of the continent became, for a while, the richest trading nation in the world. And it did it not with the galleon's drama, but with the fluyt's arithmetic. Would a pirate have looked twice at one? Not with much excitement. A fluyt full of Baltic timber is not a chest of Spanish silver, but she was cheap and roomy and easy to handle with few men, and now and then a pirate would take one simply to use, as a storeship to hold plunder and provisions, or as a plain and useful hull to get from one place to another. She was never the prize. She was, more often, just a good tool, which is exactly what she was designed to be. So we have walked from the smallest quick sloop up through the great fighting ships and the treasure carriers and the humble cargo hauler. But there is a whole world of even smaller craft we have been sailing past, the little boats that swarmed around every big ship like ducklings around a hen. And they did far more of the real work than their size suggests. So let's come down to the water's edge and look at them. The pinnace the cutter, the ketch, and the longboat. Start with the longboat, because every large ship carried one, and a crew's life could depend on it. The longboat was the biggest of the boats a ship carried nested on her deck, a stout open boat driven by oars, and by a small sail when the wind served. She was the ship's link to the land and to other ships. When there was no dock, and often there was not, it was the longboat that ferried the men ashore, and brought the fresh water out in heavy casks, and carried the sick, and carried the cargo, and carried the messages. And she did one job that could save a ship outright. When a vessel was becalmed, or drifting toward danger with no wind to steer by, the crew would load an anchor into the longboat, row it out ahead as far as the cable would reach, drop it, and then haul the whole ship up to it by main strength on the capstan. That back-breaking trick was called kedging, and more than one ship crept out of danger that way, dragged forward foot by the men in her own longboat. Then there is the pinnace, which is really two things wearing one name. In its smaller sense, a pinnace was a light ship's boat, quicker and finer than the heavy longboat, rowed by a crew and rigged with a sail or two, used for the swift work. Scouting ahead to sound out a safe anchorage, carrying an officer between ships, slipping quietly toward a shore in the dark or toward another vessel with armed men aboard. In its larger sense, a pinnace could be a small, independent, two-masted vessel in her own right, useful for exploring unknown coasts and working the shallow trade, especially in the early colonial years. Either way, the word carried the same flavor: small, quick, handy, and useful for getting close to things. The cutter is the pinnace's faster cousin, and if the sloop is the small ship a pirate loved, the cutter is the small boat a smuggler loved. She had a single mast, fore and aft rigged, but she pushed the idea hard, with a long bowsprit reaching well out ahead and a generous spread of sail, so that for her size she was very fast and could sail close to the wind. Navies used cutters as swift tenders and dispatch boats to carry orders and to dart in and out where a bigger ship could not go. And precisely because she was so fast and so weatherly, the cutter became the favorite of the men who ran contraband past the customs officers, and then, in a nice irony, the favorite of the customs officers who chased them. Speed is speed, whichever side you are on. Last, the ketch. Two masts, but arranged in a particular way, a tall mainmast set well forward, and a shorter mast, the mizzen, stepped behind it, forward of where the rudder turns. That layout left the front of the ship relatively open and uncluttered, and it made the ketch handy and easy to work in the coasting and fishing trades where she spent most of her life. But navies found another use for that open foredeck. They set a great heavy mortar there, a stubby cannon that lobbed exploding shells high into the air and down onto shore forts and towns. A ketch fitted this way was called a bomb ketch, and the space where a foremast would have stood was exactly the room the mortar needed. So the same humble little rig that carried fish along a quiet coast could also, dressed for war, throw fire over a castle wall. None of these little craft would frighten anyone on the open sea. But do not mistake small for unimportant. A great deal of actual piracy happened not from the deck of a towering ship, but from the thwarts of an open boat, a longboat or a pinnace full of armed men, rowing hard and silent toward a merchantman lying still in a dead calm, close enough to grapple and board before anyone aboard quite understood what was happening. The big ship was the threat. The little boat was often the hand that actually did the taking. So it is worth remembering them, these small, quiet workers, riding at the side of every story we have told. Now let's leave the cold gray waters of the Atlantic and the North and sail south and east into a warmer, bluer sea to meet a ship shaped by an entirely different world, the xebec of the Mediterranean. Everything we have looked at so far was shaped, in the end, by the great oceans, by the long swells of the Atlantic, the endless winds, the months out of sight of land. The Mediterranean is a different kind of sea, and it grew a different kind of ship. It is smaller and nearly closed, ringed by coasts on every side, so no place is very far from land. Its winds are lighter and more fickle, often dying away to a flat calm under a hot sky. And for thousands of years it had been a sea of oars, of galleys rowed by ranks of men, because when the wind failed, oars were the only thing that still worked. The xebec was the ship that grew out of that world, and it kept a little of the galley in its bones. Picture a long, low, lean hull, narrow and fine for speed, but carried on a generous beam so it could spread a lot of sail. Both ends reach out and overhang the water, the bow thrusting forward and the stern hanging out behind, which gives the xebec a distinctive, almost predatory profile, quite unlike the round, bluff northern ships. She was not big, rarely more than about 200 tons, and she carried a rig built for exactly this sea. 2 masts at first, later 3, hung with lateen sails, those great triangles set on long, slanting yards, the rig of the Mediterranean since ancient times. A lateen sail is superb at sailing close to the wind, letting the ship claw up toward the breeze at a sharp angle. And when there was no breeze at all, the xebec still had an answer, because she could be fitted with oars and rowed and made to move across a mirror-flat sea when every sailing ship around her sat helpless and still. Think about what that combination gave you. On a light wind day, you could sail rings around a clumsy square rigger. On a dead calm day, you could row up to it while it lay there motionless, unable to run, unable to turn its guns, unable to do anything but wait for you. That is a terrible thing to be on the receiving end of, and it made the xebec the favorite ship of the corsairs of the Barbary coast, the raiders who sailed out of the ports of North Africa, from Algiers and Tunis and Tripoli and Salé, for centuries. She was cheap to build and cheap to keep. She needed fewer men at the oars than an old galley had, so more of her crew could be fighting men, and she carried a large crew for her size, anywhere from around 90 men to several hundred, because her whole method of attack depended on boarding. She would carry guns, sometimes only a few, sometimes as many as 30 or 40 in the larger ones, along with a scatter of small swivel guns on the rail. But the guns were not really the point. The point was to catch you, run alongside, and pour a crowd of armed men over your rail before you could organize a defense. Speed to catch, numbers to overwhelm. The guns were only there to make you think twice about resisting, and the purpose of it all was grim and worth naming plainly rather than dressing up. The Barbary corsairs raided merchant shipping in coastal towns all around the Mediterranean and sometimes far beyond it, out into the Atlantic and as far north as the coasts of Britain and Ireland, and once even Iceland. And what they were most often after was not cargo, but people. Captives, to be ransomed if they were worth money, or sold into slavery if they were not. For the towns along those coasts, the sight of lateen sails on the horizon was one of the most feared things in the world, because it could mean the loss not of your goods, but of your family. So the xebec is a beautiful ship to look at, low and fast and elegant, and it is worth remembering that its beauty was bent, for a very long time, to a cruel purpose. Ships are tools, and tools take the shape of what they are used for. Later, Navies of the Mediterranean nations built xebecs of their own to fight the corsairs on their own terms. And some of these carried a mixed rig, square sails on the foremast for running and lateen sails behind for handiness, trying to get the best of both. But the shape and the spirit stayed the same. A creature of a warm, half-closed, light-aired sea, where oars still mattered and the coast was never far, and where the oldest kind of sea raiding carried on long after it had faded on the great oceans to the west. Now let's sail even further from where we began, all the way to the far side of the world, to the coasts and rivers of southern China, to meet a ship built on ideas that European shipwrights would not match for centuries, and to meet the pirate who commanded more of them than anyone in history. The junk and the fleet of Zheng Yi Sao. The word junk covers a whole family of Chinese ships, from little riverboats up to great ocean-going traders and warships. And they were built on a plan quite unlike anything in Europe. Two of their ideas stand out, and both were, frankly, ahead of their time. The first was inside the hull. A Chinese junk was built with watertight bulkheads, solid walls dividing the inside of the ship into separate sealed compartments, like the chambers of a honeycomb. If the hull was holed in one place, only that one compartment flooded. The rest stayed dry, and the ship stayed afloat. European ships were mostly one long open hull inside, so a bad enough leak anywhere could sink the whole vessel. The Chinese had solved that problem long before, and the world would eventually copy it in every steel ship afloat today. The second idea was up in the rig, and it is the thing that gives a junk its unmistakable look. The junk sail is stiffened its whole width by a ladder of horizontal battens, light poles running from side to side, so that the sail opens and closes like a folding fan, or like a wide slatted blind. It sounds humble. It is quietly brilliant. Those battens hold the sail flat and steady, so it drives well even close to the wind. They let a small crew raise and lower and shorten sail quickly and safely, without anyone having to climb aloft, because you simply let the sail drop and it folds itself down along the battens. A junk could be worked hard, in bad weather, by fewer and less specialized hands than a European ship of the same size needed. It was forgiving and tough and efficient, and it carried Chinese trade across thousands of miles of coast and open sea. Centuries before our story, a Chinese admiral named Zheng He had led fleets of enormous treasure junks across the Indian Ocean, ships so large that historians still argue about just how big they really were. The junk was an old and deeply capable design, long before any pirate flew a flag from one. And the greatest pirate fleet the world has ever seen was a fleet of junks. It sailed not in the classic golden age of the Caribbean, which had ended a century before, but in the early 1800s, off the coast of southern China, and it was commanded, in all but name, and often in name too, by a woman. She is known to history as Zheng Yi Sao, which means the wife of Zheng Yi. She had married a formidable pirate leader named Zheng Yi, and when he died, around the year 1807, she did not fade quietly away. She took command of his entire confederation, and then she made it far larger and far more disciplined than it had ever been under him. The numbers are almost hard to believe, and the estimates vary, so hold them as a range rather than a certainty. At its height, her confederation may have numbered several hundred junks. Some counts say around 400 of the fighting vessels, and many hundreds more of smaller craft, crewed by somewhere between 40,000 and 70,000 pirates. She organized this vast force into squadrons, each under its own colored banner, red and black and blue and white and yellow and purple. And the greatest of them was the red flag fleet. She ran it with a strict written code, rules about plunder and about the treatment of captives, enforced hard. And with it, she fought the navy of the Qing Emperor, and the Portuguese, and the British. And for several years she more or less won, or at least could not be beaten, controlling the coastal trade and the fishing grounds and the river mouths of a whole region of China. And here is the ending that makes her almost unique among pirates. She was not hunted down and hanged. She was not killed by grape shot on her own deck. In the year 1810, holding a hand far too strong for the authorities to simply crush, she negotiated. She surrendered on her own terms, secured a pardon for herself and for thousands of her men, kept a good deal of her wealth and a number of her ships, and walked away into a long and comfortable retirement, dying peacefully decades later, in her late 60s. She had commanded more ships and more men than any pirate in the classic age of the Atlantic ever dreamed of, in the tough, clever, folding-sailed junks of the China coast, and she had known exactly when to stop, which is a kind of seamanship all its own. So we have sailed a very long way now, from a quiet home harbor all the way around the world. Let's turn back toward where we started and look, before we finish, at the plainest ships of all, the everyday ones, that were the real sea. Here is something easy to forget after a tour of galleons and warships and pirate flagships. Almost none of the ships at sea on any given day were any of those things. The great majority were plain, working merchant ships, the ordinary carriers of ordinary goods, and they were the real body of the age of sail. They were also, almost always, what a pirate actually caught. Not a treasure fleet, not a striped Indiaman, a modest merchantman with a few guns and a tired crew, hauling sugar or tobacco or salt fish from one port to another. If you want to picture the sea as it truly was, picture these: quiet, unremarkable, everywhere. A merchantman might be any size and any rig. She might be a little sloop working between islands, or a two-masted brig on the coasting trade, or a full-rigged ship crossing an ocean with a hold full of cargo. What she was not was heavily armed. Guns cost money, took up space that could hold cargo, and needed men who had to be paid and fed. So a merchant owner carried just enough guns to discourage trouble and no more, and prayed he would never meet anyone serious. That calculation, cargo over cannon, is exactly what made these ships such tempting prey, and exactly why the sight of a pirate's flag so often ended a chase without a shot. The merchant captain had done the sums long before. His life was worth more than his owner's cloth. A few of these working ships had names worth knowing, because their shapes were so useful, they lasted. There was the bark, a word that drifted in meaning over the years. In the earlier days it meant, loosely, a small ship, a plain working vessel of no fixed rig. Later, it hardened into something specific, a ship of 3 or more masts, square-rigged on all of them but the last, which carried a fore-and-aft sail instead. That arrangement was a quiet piece of economy, because it let a big ship be handled by fewer men than a full-rigged ship needed, and so the bark rig became a favorite of thrifty owners for long ocean voyages in the later age of sail. There was the Pink, a small ship easy to know by her stern, which narrowed to a high, overhanging, almost pinched point at the back. That odd shape gave her a roomy hold for her size, and Pinks were used all over the Atlantic and the Mediterranean for carrying cargo and for fishing, plain and useful and cheap. And there was the Cat, or the cat-built collier, one of the humblest and most quietly admired hulls of the whole age. She came from the coal trade of the North Sea, from ports like Whitby on the English coast, built to haul heavy loads of coal down to the cities, so she was made bluff and broad and strong, with a flat, shallow bottom, roomy in the hold, cheap to build, and able to be run gently up onto a beach and left sitting on the sand at low tide without harm, so she could be worked on or unloaded anywhere. Nothing about her was elegant. Everything about her was tough and practical. And it is no accident that when the Navy went looking for ships to send a man named James Cook to explore the far side of the world on voyages that would last for years in unknown waters, they did not choose a sleek frigate. They chose cat-built colliers out of Whitby and renamed one of them the Endeavour. They wanted a ship that was strong, roomy, shallow enough to poke into strange coasts, and able to be beached and mended 1,000 miles from any dockyard. The plain coal carrier was, it turned out, one of the finest exploring ships ever made. And there is one more kind of working merchantman that has to be named honestly, because it sits underneath so much of this story, including two of the most famous pirate ships of all. The slave ship. Both Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge and Sam Bellamy's Whydah began their lives as ships built or fitted to carry enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, packed below decks in conditions of almost unimaginable cruelty, as ordinary a piece of commerce in that world as hauling grain or timber. These were not special ships. That is the hard part. They were plain merchantmen, put to a terrible use, sailing a regular trade that made fortunes for men who never saw the inside of a hold. When we admire the lines of an old ship, it is worth holding both things at once. The beauty of the craft, and the weight of what some of that craft was built to do. The sea carried wonders in these hulls, and it carried horrors, and often in the very same ship. So the ordinary merchantman was the true sea, and the true prey. Which raises the last question of our whole tour, and it is a good one to end the working part of the story on. How did any of these plain ships, a sloop, a brig, a captured French slaver, become a pirate ship at all? What actually changed? The answer is that almost nothing about the wood changed, and almost everything about the ship changed, and the difference was the people aboard, and a few hard weeks of work. A pirate almost never built a ship. Building ships took shipyards, and money, and time, and left a trail. A pirate took a ship, usually a merchantman he had just captured, and if she was better than the one he already had, he simply moved into her. Then he set about making her his own. The first thing he often did was cut her down. A merchant ship carried tall cabins and high rails and comfortable quarters at the stern, all of which caught the wind and added weight up high. Pirates would cut a lot of that away, lowering the upper works toward a long, clear, flush deck. It made the ship lighter and faster and steadier, and it gave a crowd of men a clean run from one end to the other for fighting and for boarding. Then they cut new gun ports along her sides and strengthened her decks to bear the weight, and they filled those ports with cannon, taken one prize at a time from every ship they caught. A merchantman with 6 guns could become, over a season of captures, a raider with 20 or 30. That is how a Blackbeard turned a slave ship into a 40-gun terror. Not by building, by taking and cutting and arming, a little at a time. And they kept her fast, which meant careening. Every few weeks or months, a pirate crew would find a quiet cove or a lonely island, run their ship gently aground, or haul her over onto her side with tackles and scrape her exposed bottom clean of the weed and the shipworm that fouled every wooden hull and slowed it down. It was filthy, exhausting, vital work, and it was also the crew's most vulnerable moment, their ship helpless on the sand, so they chose their spots carefully, out of the shipping lanes, away from the Navy. Certain islands and inlets became known haunts precisely because they were good places to careen in peace, And then there was the flag, which was a weapon all its own. A pirate flew a plain black flag, or one marked with a skull, or a skeleton, or a bleeding heart, or a figure holding a spear or an hourglass, each captain with his own grim device. And the flag was not really about identity, it was about ending fights before they began. A black flag run up the mast said, in a language every sailor understood, "Surrender now, and you will be spared. Resist, and you will not." Fear did the fighting, so that the guns usually did not have to. The most successful pirates fought remarkably few real battles. They frightened far more than they fought. The flag, the cut-down deck full of armed men, the row of cannon, all of it was theater with real teeth, designed to make resistance look like madness. So a pirate ship, in the end, was not a kind of ship at all. There was no such thing on the shipwright's plans. It was any ship, a sloop or a brig or a frigate or a slaver, taken by a particular kind of crew and remade in their image, cut down for speed and boarding, filled with stolen guns, kept scraped and fast, and flying a flag meant to make you give up before you were hurt. Which means that every single ship we have walked past tonight was, in the right hands and the wrong times, a pirate ship waiting to happen. We keep coming back to the guns. All night we have been counting them. A 10-gun sloop, a 40-gun frigate, a 100-gun first rate. So before the light goes for good, it is worth understanding what that counting actually meant, because it is the thing that decided almost every meeting at sea. A ship's great guns were cannon, heavy tubes of iron, each one lying on a stout wooden carriage fitted with small solid wheels, called trucks, so it could be hauled back and forth across the deck. The guns lived along the sides of the ship, pointing outward through square openings cut in the hull, called gun ports, which could be closed with a hinged lid in bad weather to keep the sea out. On the biggest ships, these rows of guns ran the whole length of the vessel, on one deck, or two, or three, stacked one above another. That is all those numbers ever meant. 100-gun ship was a ship with 100 iron tubes ranged along her sides, waiting. And each gun was named by the weight of the iron ball it threw. Not by how big the gun itself was, but by how heavy its shot. A gun that fired a solid iron ball weighing about 9 pounds was a 9-pounder. One that threw a 12-pound ball was a 12-pounder. The heaviest guns on the greatest warships were 32-pounders, throwing a ball the size of a large grapefruit, heavy enough that a man could barely lift it in one hand, and hard enough to smash clean through 2 feet of solid oak. The bigger the shot, the more damage it did, and the more men it took to work the gun. So the heaviest guns always went low, down on the bottom deck, partly because a ship could not carry such weight high up without becoming top-heavy and unsteady, and partly because keeping all that iron down low actually helped hold her upright. The lighter guns went up above. A great warship was, in a way, a careful pyramid of iron, heaviest at the bottom, lightest at the top. So what happened when all of them fired at once? What was a broadside, really? It was the whole point of the ship. Every gun along one side, fired together, or in a fast-rolling sequence from bow to stern, throwing its entire weight of iron at the enemy in a single crashing moment. That is why the great ships fought in a line, one behind another, each one turning her broadside toward the foe. Everything about a warship, her length, her strength, her rows of ports, existed to bring the greatest possible weight of iron to bear on the side of another ship. A first rate could throw, in a single broadside, more than 1/2 ton of iron. The noise of it was beyond almost anything a person will ever hear. and the smoke hung so thick that after a few minutes the gun crews often could not see the enemy at all and simply loaded and fired into the gray by feel and by drill. And working even one of those guns took a team. A big gun needed a crew of anywhere from 6 to a dozen men. They hauled it back inboard with rope and tackle. They sponged out the barrel to kill any lingering spark. They loaded the powder and the ball and rammed it home. They heaved the heavy carriage back out until the muzzle poked through the port. They aimed by shifting the whole gun with handspikes and wedges. And then they fired, and the gun leapt back with the recoil, caught only by a thick rope, and the whole dance began again. A well-drilled crew could do all of that in a couple of minutes, over and over, until their arms failed or the battle ended. It was hot, deafening, dangerous work on a closed wooden deck full of smoke and flame. Not every gun was a great gun, though. Along the rails, up high, ships carried little ones called swivel guns, small enough to be set on a post and turned by a single man, aimed almost like a hunting piece. These were not for smashing hulls. They were loaded with a scatter of musket balls or small shot and fired across an enemy's deck to sweep it clear of men just before boarding. And that made the swivel gun the pirate's particular friend, because it needed almost no crew, cost almost nothing, and did exactly what a pirate wanted, which was to clear a deck and frighten a crew into giving up, without wrecking the valuable ship underneath them, which points to something worth knowing about the shot itself, because it came in different kinds for different jobs. There was round shot, the solid iron ball, for smashing through a hull. There was chain shot and bar shot, 2 half balls joined by a length of chain or an iron bar, which spun through the air and was meant to tear through canvas and cut through rigging, to bring down an enemy's masts and leave her crippled and unable to run. And there was grape shot, a cluster of smaller iron balls that spread out like a giant blast from a shotgun, made not for the ship, but for the men standing on her. It was grape shot that killed Bartholomew Roberts on his own deck. So a gunner chose his shot for his purpose: iron for the hull, chain for the sails, grape for the men. Now here is why all of this mattered so much to a pirate, and why we kept counting. A pirate almost never actually wanted to fire these guns in anger. Firing meant a real fight, and a real fight meant damage to the very ship and cargo he was trying to steal, and worse, it meant men killed, his own among them. What he wanted was the count. He wanted to come up on a merchantman carrying 6 small guns while showing 30 of his own, so that the plain arithmetic did the work for him. The merchant captain looked across the water, counted the open ports, understood in a glance that he could not win, and struck his colors. No broadside, no blood, just a surrender, and a prize taken whole. The guns were most useful precisely when they stayed silent. They were a threat far more than a tool, and the cleverest pirates lived and grew rich in the space between the two. And it helped them that the guns of the age were not the far-reaching, deadly accurate weapons you might picture. They were short-ranged and rough, and truly deadly only close in, a few hundred yards, sometimes much less, muzzle almost to muzzle. Sea battles were fought near enough to shout across, so the count and the show mattered as much as the firing ever did, because everyone knew that if it truly came to blows, it would be close, and terrible, and uncertain for both sides. So there it is, the thing that ran quietly beneath this whole tour. Every ship we have looked at tonight, from the smallest sloop to the towering first rate, was arranged, in the end, around one plain question: how much iron can I throw, and how much can I stand to take? That was the fighting heart of all of them. The rig carried them there. The hull held them up. But the guns decided what happened when 2 of them finally met. Now the harbor is getting dark, and the tour is nearly done. So let's come back down, slowly, from the masthead to the deck to the water, and back to where you are lying right now. Because underneath all the differences we have talked about tonight, the rigs and the tonnage and the guns, every one of these ships was, at the end of the day, the same thing. A small wooden world, holding a handful of people, floating on top of a very large and very dark sea. And at night, when the work was done, they were more alike than they were different. So before we finish, let's stand on the deck of one of them in the dark, any of them, it does not much matter which, and just be there for a moment. It is late. The ship is at anchor, or ghosting slowly along under easy sail in a light night wind. Above you, the masts and the rigging make a black web against a sky full of stars, swaying very slowly back and forth as the hull rolls, a long, gentle, patient motion, the same motion in every ship that ever floated. And the sounds. That is what you would notice most. A ship at night is never quite silent, but its sounds are soft and steady and old. The creak of the timbers as the hull works against the sea, a slow groan and settle over and over. The quiet slap and gurgle of water moving along the planking, just there, on the other side of the wood from your hand. The hum of the wind in the rigging, high and thin, rope shifting against wood. Somewhere, a loose block knocking gently, and every so often, the ship's bell, marking the passing of the watch, a small, clear sound carried away at once by the dark. Come down off the deck now, down a steep ladder into the body of the ship, and it gets darker and closer and warmer. The decks below are low, so low a tall man has to stoop, and they are crowded with everything a floating world needs: barrels of water and salt meat and beer, coils of spare rope, chests, the great anchor cables, thick as your leg. Down here the air is thick too, with the smells that soaked into every wooden ship ever built: tar and hemp and salt and damp oak and tallow and smoke and the sea. If you have ever smelled an old wooden boat, you already know it, a little. It is one of the oldest smells there is. And here, in the dark, most of the crew are asleep. In the older ships, men slept where they could find room, on chests, on the deck, among the cargo. In the Navy's ships, they slept in hammocks slung close together from the beams overhead, a whole deck of them, swinging all together with the roll of the ship, so gently that the motion that would make a landsman ill rocked these men to sleep like children. Picture that, a low dark deck, warm with the heat of bodies, and rows of sleeping sailors swinging slowly in the dark, all in time, while the ship carries them on, because a ship never fully sleeps. That is the quiet miracle of it. While most of the crew rest, a few stay awake, up on deck, keeping the watch. They mind the wind and the sails and the course. They listen and they look out into the dark, and they measure the passing hours the old way by turning a glass of running sand. And when it runs out, they turn it again and ring the bell, so that even in your sleep, deep in the hull, that soft bell tells you the night is passing and someone is awake and the ship is being kept. 4 hours on watch, 4 hours below, around the clock, forever, so that there was always someone holding the ship while everyone else let go. The sleepers could let go precisely because the watch did not. It is one of the kindest arrangements human beings ever made. Some stay awake so that the rest can safely sleep. And that was true on all of them, on the little sloop with her handful of men, on the towering ship of the line with her hundreds, on the treasure galleon and the plain fluyt and the folding-sailed junk on the far side of the world. Different hulls, different rigs, different flags, different seas. But at night, the same. A few dozen or a few hundred people, asleep inside a shell of wood, wrapped in the dark, held by the sea, trusting the timbers and the watch and the slow turning of the sand to carry them through to the morning. Every ship we have talked about tonight became, in the dark, that one simple thing. So let's come back down the rest of the way now. Up out of the hold, past the sleepers, onto the deck one last time. The stars overhead, the black water all around, going out forever. The bell, soft, marking the watch. And then let the ship go, and let the water go, and come all the way back to the room you are actually in. Think for a moment about how far we have come tonight, and how much of it you can already feel slipping pleasantly out of reach. That is fine. It is meant to. We started with something simple. How to read a ship, the hull and how much it carries, the masts and how many, the rig and which way it likes the wind, and how deep it sits in the water. Just 4 things. And from those 4 things, the whole crowded harbor unfolded. The little sloop, quick and shallow, the ship a pirate loved because it could always run and always hide. The schooner, the sloop with a second mast, weatherly and fast off the American coast. The 2-masted workers, the raffish brigantine, the solid brig, the clever snow with its whisper of an extra mast. The great full-rigged ship, 3 towers of square canvas, the shape you see when you close your eyes and think of a tall ship, the shape of Sam Bellamy's Whydah going north into the storm. The Spanish galleon, high-castled and heavy and rich, the dream that was almost never really taken. The man of war, and the rating system that ran from the 100-gun first rate down through the ships of the line, all the way up to Nelson's Victory, still sitting in her dock tonight. The frigate, fast and lean, the pirate's highest reach, and the pirate's most likely undoing, the shape of Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge and Bartholomew Roberts' Royal Fortune. The giant striped East Indiaman, a merchant ship dressed as a warship. The plain, cheap fluyt that quietly made a small nation rich. The little working craft, the longboat and the pinnace and the cutter and the ketch that did so much of the real work. The lean xebec of the warm southern sea, all lateen sails and oars. And the folding-sailed junk on the far side of the world in the great fleet of Zheng Yi Sao. And under all of it, the plain merchantman, the true sea, and the true prey. And then, at the very end, all of them became the same thing in the dark. A little wooden world, holding sleeping people, floating on a wide sea, kept safe through the night by a few who stayed awake. Now, let the ships go. All of them. Let them settle back down into the harbor of the past where they belong, riding quietly at their anchors, and come the rest of the way home. Because you are not on any of them. You are here, in your own room, in your own bed, warm and still and safe, with the covers over you and the dark all around. And there is no watch for you to keep tonight. Feel where your body is resting, the weight of you settling down into the mattress, your head on the pillow, your hands, wherever they have come to rest, gone soft and heavy, the small rise and fall of your own breathing, slow now, slower than when we began. That gentle motion is not so different from a hull rocking at anchor. You are, in your own quiet way, a ship at rest tonight, made fast in a safe harbor, going nowhere until morning. And you carry more of all this than you might think. Remember, right at the start, the words, the ones that came off the deck of a wooden ship and into your mouth without your ever noticing. They are still there, taken aback, leeway, the bitter end, 3 sheets to the wind. You will use them again tomorrow, and again for the rest of your life, and every time you do, a little of the age of sail will move through you. 300 years after the last of these ships we spoke of first put to sea, the salt in your blood keeps its old slow tide. The sea is in the language, and the language is in you. You do not have to do anything with that. It is simply true, and it is quietly yours. So you do not have to hold on to any of it. Not the difference between a brig and a brigantine, not the rating system, or the tonnage of a galleon, or how many guns the Queen Anne's Revenge carried, or where the Whydah went down. You do not have to remember a single name. There will be no test in the morning, and there never was going to be. It was only ever something to rest your mind against while the day let go of you. If it is already fading, if the ships are already blurring gently together into one soft picture of masts and sails and dark water, then it is working exactly as it should. Let it fade. Let it all fade, because all of it will still be there in the morning, and it does not need you to keep it. The Victory will still be in her dock at Portsmouth, 3,500 tons of oak held together by patient hands, exactly as she was. The Whydah will still be lying under the sand off Cape Cod, keeping her long quiet, as she has for 300 years. The old logbooks and the ship plans and the paintings of harbors will still be sitting in their archives and their galleries, in the flat, careful ink of men long gone. Zheng Yi Sao will still have won, and retired, and slipped away clean. And somewhere, right now, on some dark ocean, a ship you will never see is ghosting along under the same stars, with most of her people asleep and a few of them awake, keeping the watch, turning the glass, ringing the bell. None of it asks anything of you tonight. It never did. It was all here long before you, and it will all still be here after, carrying on perfectly well without a single thing from you. So just rest. Let the watch belong to someone else tonight. Let the ships sail on without you, the way they always have, the way they are very good at. You do not have to stay awake for any of it. You do not have to keep a lookout. The harbor is quiet. The water is calm. The bell is soft and far away now, marking a watch that is not yours to stand. Your breathing is slow. The room is dark. The bed is holding you the way a calm sea holds a ship at anchor, easily, without effort, asking nothing. The sails are furled. The lines are made fast. The watch is set, and it is not you. And you are already home, and already still, and already halfway to sleep, drifting down and in and under, into the deep and quiet water, where everyone goes in the end, which is only rest, and nothing more. And it has been waiting for you all along. So let go now, and sleep.